The polished marble floors of the Atlanta Federal Courthouse gleamed under the midday sun as Clayton Rhodes strutted through the entrance, ignoring the sea of protesters chanting for justice. Inside, the atmosphere shifted from tense murmurs to stunned silence when Clayton openly mocked Judge Malcolm Reed, calling him just another diversity hire. But arrogance has its price. 2 minutes later, Clayton clutched his chest, collapsing mid-smirk, gasping for air as paramedics rushed. And the man he humiliated now held his fate in his hands. Would Judge Reed show mercy? Before we dive into the full story, comment below where you're watching from. If you believe in standing up for justice, hit like and subscribe to hear more stories like this. 2 weeks earlier, the sun cast long shadows across the towering glass facade of Rhodes International Holdings, Clayton Rhodes's multi-billion-dollar real estate empire. From the corner office on the 50th floor, Clayton gazed down at the bustling Atlanta streets, sipping a $12 espresso with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he owned the city. His assistant, Maya, knocked lightly before stepping in, her expression tight. "Mr. Rhodes," she began, voice low but urgent. "The federal investigation into the Riverbend project is intensifying. The SEC has requested additional documents, and the DOJ just confirmed the fraud case is moving to trial." Clayton didn't flinch. Instead, a slow smile curved his lips as he leaned back in his leather chair, the skyline glittering behind him like a crown. "Let them try," he drawled, swirling the espresso in its delicate cup. "I've crushed bigger threats than some pencil pushers with subpoenas." Maya hesitated. "There's more. Judge Malcolm Reed has been assigned to the case." That caught his attention. Clayton sat up, eyes narrowing. "Reed?" He chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "Perfect. This'll be easier than I thought. A black judge in a high-profile white-collar case? He'll bend over backward to prove he's impartial. Probably scared to death of looking biased against a successful white businessman." He sneered, placing the cup down with a sharp clink. "We'll play the race card against him before he even thinks about using it himself." He picked up the phone and dialed Preston Hale, his lead attorney, a shark in a suit notorious for exploiting legal loopholes. "Preston, get your team on this. I want everything on Reed, personal, professional, hell, find out what he eats for breakfast. And start pushing for pre-trial motions. Drown them in paperwork. If they think they can drag me down, they're in for a rude awakening." Meanwhile, across town, Judge Malcolm Reed sat in his modest home office, reviewing the case file. The sun cast warm rays across his desk, highlighting the photos of his wife Angela and their 2 teenage kids. 20 years on the bench had hardened him, but this case struck a nerve. The pages detailed the destruction Clayton Rhodes had left in his wake. Retirement funds drained, small businesses foreclosed, families displaced from affordable housing, developments that had suddenly tripled in rent. It wasn't just fraud, it was systemic predation. His phone buzzed, a message from Angela. "Don't stay too late. Dinner's at 7. Jalen's got news." Reed smiled, but the warmth faded as he turned back to the documents. One report stood out. An anonymous whistleblower, Marcus Hall, a mid-level accountant at Rhodes Enterprises, had risked everything to leak internal emails exposing Clayton's web of shell companies. But Marcus was black, and Reed knew all too well how quickly Clayton's team would exploit that fact, twisting the narrative to paint Marcus as an angry, unreliable employee playing the victim. The next morning, Reed found more than just legal briefs on his doorstep. A small charred envelope lay among the morning papers. Inside was a note, the words burned into the paper, "Stay in your place, or we'll put you there." His jaw clenched. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, and the lengths men like Clayton would go to maintain it. Angela, noticing his tense posture, stepped closer. "Another threat?" she asked quietly. He nodded, slipping the note into the file. "You need to recuse yourself, Malcolm. This case, it's different. They're not just playing legal games, they're playing dirty." Reed met her worried gaze and exhaled slowly. "If I step down, they win. If I stay, maybe, just maybe, we prove that justice isn't for sale." Across town, Clayton reclined in his penthouse suite, watching news coverage of his upcoming trial. His phone buzzed. Preston Hale again. "We've got inside court information," Hale said, voice brimming with confidence. "Reed's wife is a high school principal. His son's applying for internships. If we push the right narrative, that Reed's going after you to protect his community, we can undermine him without lifting a finger." Clayton laughed, raising his crystal glass in a mock toast. "Good. Let's remind the world why men like me stay on top, and why men like Reed never will." The towering columns of the Atlanta Federal Courthouse loomed overhead as Clayton Rhodes arrived for his first hearing. A fleet of black SUVs pulled up to the curb, their tinted windows reflecting the angry crowd gathered behind police barricades. Protesters waved signs that read, "Justice for Workers," and "Rhodes stole our future," their chants rising like a tidal wave. Camera flashes exploded as Clayton stepped out, impeccably dressed in a navy Tom Ford suit, the smirk on his face as polished as his Italian leather shoes. He paused for the cameras, adjusting his platinum cufflinks, and muttered to his attorney, Preston Hale, "Do you hear that? That's the sound of people who'll be begging me for jobs when this circus is over." Preston, ever the pragmatist, nodded but remained tense. "Don't underestimate Judge Reed. He's no rookie, and the prosecution's evidence is tighter than I expected." Clayton chuckled. "Please. A black judge overseeing a case against a white millionaire? He'll trip over himself trying to prove he's unbiased. All I have to do is rattle him." Inside the courtroom, Judge Malcolm Reed sat behind the bench, reviewing case notes while the gallery filled with spectators, reporters, and victims of Clayton's schemes. The air buzzed with anticipation. The lead prosecutor, ADA Yasmin Carter, stood near the evidence table, her silver-streaked hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her expression was one of quiet determination. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Reed entered. The room stood, falling silent as the judge, clad in traditional black robes, took his seat. His eyes swept the courtroom, pausing briefly on Clayton, who sat with casual arrogance, legs crossed, fingers drumming on the polished oak defense table. Yasmin Carter began the prosecution's opening statement, her voice clear and controlled. "This case is not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about lives destroyed by unchecked greed. Mr. Rhodes didn't just manipulate markets. He stole retirement funds from teachers, firefighters, and single parents. He crushed small businesses under the weight of fraudulent loans and hollow investments, and he did it without remorse." As she spoke, the overhead screens flickered to life, displaying flowcharts of Rhodes' shell companies, webs of LLCs funneling money into offshore accounts. The gallery murmured as they saw the sheer scale of the scheme. One elderly woman in the front row, clutching a worn photograph, wiped away tears. Her husband had worked for 30 years, only to find his pension gone overnight. But Clayton leaned, back in his chair, bored, fingers tapping an idle rhythm against the table. When Yasmin mentioned the stolen $400 million from union pension funds, Clayton whispered to Preston, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "This is cute, like watching a kid try to build sandcastles before the tide rolls." In Judge Reed's dark eyes flicked up, catching the whisper. His expression remained neutral, but something in his gaze sharpened. He'd seen that arrogance before, the untouchable confidence of men who believed the system worked for them, and them alone. Men like Clayton never believed consequences applied to them. Finally, it was Preston Hale's turn. He strode to the center of the room, his tailored suit immaculate, his tone calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution's story is compelling, but stories aren't facts. My client is a self-made man, an innovator who built communities, not destroyed them. The prosecution's so-called evidence is circumstantial at best, based largely on hearsay, from disgruntled ex-employees with personal vendettas." He glanced toward Marcus Hall, the whistleblower sitting quietly in the gallery. Marcus, a middle-aged black man in a worn suit, stiffened under the attention. "And let's not ignore the elephant in the room," Preston continued, his smile almost patronizing. "Judge Reed presiding over a case involving a prominent white businessman accused of defrauding underprivileged communities. The optics alone raise questions of impartiality." The courtroom gasped. Yasmin sprang to her feet. "Objection. Your Honor, the defense is making inflammatory, racially charged statements with no basis in fact." Judge Reed's gavel cracked against the bench. "Sustained. Mr. Hale, one more comment like that and I'll hold you in contempt." but Clayton was grinning. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and called out, "Touch a nerve there, Your Honor. Can't say I'm surprised." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Even Preston looked alarmed, tugging at Clayton's sleeve. But Clayton shrugged him off, standing casually as though addressing an underling. "Look, let's cut the theatrics. We all know how this ends. A little show trial, a slap on the wrist, and I'm back on top by the weekend." Judge Reed's face remained a mask of composure, but the tension in the room was palpable. "Mr. Rhodes, I suggest you sit down and show the appropriate respect for these proceedings." Clayton laughed, sharp and hollow. "Respect? For what? This kangaroo court? This diversity hire pretending to hold power?" His gaze locked with Reed's, eyes glittering with malice. "Let's be honest, Judge. You're here because some committee wanted to check a box, not because you earned it." The room froze. Several jurors' mouths hung open in disbelief. Yasmin's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Even Clayton's own attorney looked horrified, whispering frantically, "Clayton, sit down, now." But Clayton wasn't finished. He leaned in, voice dripping with disdain. "Tell me, Your Honor, when you put on that robe, do you actually believe you're in charge, or do you hear the real power laughing behind your back?" The silence that followed was deafening. Reed didn't flinch, he didn't raise his voice. He simply stared at Clayton, the weight of 2 decades of fighting uphill battles etched into the hard lines of his face. Finally, Reed spoke, voice steady as granite. "Are you finished, Mr. Rhodes?" Clayton smiled coldly. "Oh, I'm just getting started." The gavel cracked once more. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. Mr. Rhodes, I suggest you reconsider your approach if you intend to maintain your defense." As the courtroom emptied, Clayton strolled out, unfazed. Flanked by his legal team, Yasmin gathered her papers, muttering, "Unbelievable. He's not even pretending to respect the process." Marcus Hall caught up to Judge Reed outside the chamber doors. "You okay, Your Honor? That wasn't just disrespect, it was personal." Reed nodded, adjusting his robe with practiced calm. "I've seen his kind before. Arrogance like that, it always cracks under pressure." But as Clayton passed the reporters outside, flashing a confident smile and mockingly waving at protesters, one thing was clear: he didn't believe he could lose. And with the system so often stacked in favor of men like him, could Reed really bring him down? Comment number 1 if you believe Clayton has finally gone too far and justice needs to be served. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what happens next. But here's the real question. When the system protects the powerful, can integrity alone truly defeat corruption? The night after the explosive courtroom showdown, Judge Malcolm Reed drove home in silence, the city lights blurring past his window. His mind churned with Clayton Rhodes' words, each syllable laced with venom. Diversity hire. Quota check. It wasn't the first time Reed had faced racism in his career, but the brazenness of it, in a federal courtroom no less, was something else entirely. Men like Rhodes didn't fear consequences because too often they never faced them. As Reed pulled into his driveway, the comforting glow of the porch light did little to ease the tightness in his chest. He stepped out, briefcase in hand, only to freeze mid-step. Across the pristine white garage door, bold red spray paint screamed, "Stay in your place, boy!" His breath caught. The word boy was underlined twice, the paint dripping like fresh blood. "Malcolm?" Angela's voice called from the doorway. She'd seen it too. Their son, Jalen, stood behind her, eyes wide with disbelief. Reed's jaw clenched. He dropped the briefcase and marched to the door, gently pushing his wife and son inside. "Lock the doors, I'm calling the police." But as he dialed, dread settled in his gut. He already knew how this would go. The officers would arrive, take photos, write a report, and nothing would come of it. Racist vandalism wasn't exactly high on the priority list. And Clayton? He'd be sipping scotch in his penthouse, laughing about it with his cronies. Angela paced the living room, arms crossed tightly. "This isn't just intimidation, Malcolm. It's personal. They know where we live. What if Jalen had come home? First, what if Reed placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "I'm not stepping down. If I back off now, they win." Jalen, usually the laid-back type, stood stiffly by the window, peeking through the blinds. "This isn't just about the case, Dad. It's about who you are. They hate that a black man is the one holding power over Rhodes." The truth stung. The attack wasn't just about Clayton's trial. It was about maintaining a hierarchy that men like Clayton had built their empires upon. And Reed, by daring to challenge it, had become a target. The next morning, Reed arrived at the courthouse, under increased security. 2 marshals flanked the entrance, their expressions grim. Inside, his chambers were quiet, too quiet. He sat at his desk reviewing motions until his phone buzzed with an anonymous email. "You don't belong here. Drop the case or next time it won't just be paint." Attached was a blurred image of his wife leaving her school campus. His heart pounded. He immediately called Angela, voice tight with panic. "Stay inside. I'm sending officers your way." Angela didn't argue. She understood the threat was real. This was no longer just courtroom theatrics. Clayton's influence extended far beyond legal boundaries. Meanwhile, Clayton sat comfortably in his skyscraper office, watching the fallout unfold on social media. Photos of Reed's vandalized garage were already circulating. Preston Hale entered, looking less assured than usual. "Clayton, this is escalating fast. If the feds catch wind that you're tied to these threats..." Clayton waved a dismissive hand. "Please, do you think some local thugs leave a paper trail? I didn't order anything. I just suggested to the right people that Reed needed a reminder of his place." Preston frowned but said nothing. He'd worked with powerful clients before, but Clayton's particular brand of entitlement, mixed with racial disdain, left a sour taste in his mouth. Back at the courthouse, the hearing resumed. Judge Reed sat tall, robe immaculate, expression unreadable. Clayton entered with his usual swagger, but the tension in the room was thicker than before. Reed noticed the subtle glances exchanged between Preston and Clayton, the way Clayton's smile widened when Reed called the court to order. He knew Clayton believed he was untouchable, but Reed had faced worse. He'd built his career fighting. Systemic racism disguised as bureaucracy, backhanded compliments masking prejudice, and subtle dismissals cloaked in civility. This was just another battle in a war he'd been fighting his whole life. The prosecution presented another round of evidence: emails, bank statements, witness testimonies. Each piece painted a clearer picture of Clayton's corruption. But midway through the session, Preston stood, feigning concern. "Your Honor," he began, voice dripping with mock sincerity, "given the recent incident at your home, wouldn't it be prudent for you to recuse yourself? Clearly, the stress of this case is compromising your ability to remain impartial." Reed's gaze didn't waver. "Mr. Hale, if you believe intimidation tactics will sway this court, you've profoundly misunderstood the meaning of justice. Motion denied." Clayton leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and muttered, "Figures." But the cracks in his armor were showing. For all his bravado, Clayton hadn't expected Reed to stand firm. He thrived on dominance, on forcing others to submit. But Reed, he was immovable. That night, Reed drove home with 2 patrol cars tailing him. The house was quiet, lights dimmed. Angela and Jalen had taken refuge at Reed's brother's house across town. He stood in the driveway, staring at the repainted garage door, now pristine white again. But the ghost of the red slur lingered in his mind. His phone buzzed. Another message. "You're not untouchable. Neither is your family." Reed exhaled slowly, resolve hardening. He stepped inside, locked the door, and sat at the kitchen table, flipping through case files. If Clayton wanted a war, he'd get one. But Reed wouldn't fight dirty. He'd fight with the very thing Clayton believed he controlled, the law. In his penthouse, Clayton toasted himself with aged bourbon, watching a news segment on Reed's resilience. He laughed, shaking his head. "They never learn," he muttered, tipping the glass back. But arrogance blinds even the most powerful, and Clayton was too drunk on supremacy to realize that the very system he thought he owned was beginning to turn against him. The next morning, Judge Malcolm Reed arrived at the courthouse to find his chambers eerily silent. His clerk, Naomi, usually the first to greet him with a warm smile and a fresh docket, sat frozen at her desk, eyes glued to her computer screen. "Judge," she stammered, spinning the monitor toward him, "you need to see this." Reed leaned in, heart sinking as he took in the image plastered across the news site. "Federal judge accused of bias in Rhodes' trial. Conflicts of interest revealed." Below the headline was a photo of Jalen, his son, shaking hands with Marcus. Hall, the whistleblower, at a community internship fair held months earlier. The article was pure spin, clearly fed to the press by Clayton's team. It claimed Jalen's connection to Hall was proof that Reed had a personal vendetta against Clayton, suggesting that Reed was weaponizing the bench to advance his community's interests. Reed's jaw clenched. It was a calculated move, designed not just to discredit him, but to paint him as the very thing Clayton had accused him of in court, a biased judge out for racial revenge. "Do you want me to call the court PR office?" Naomi asked, voice tight with concern. Reed shook his head. "No, that's exactly what Rhodes wants, for me to look defensive. We fight this in the courtroom, not the headlines, but the damage was already spreading." By noon, every major news outlet was running the story. Talking heads debated Reed's integrity, with conservative pundits openly questioning whether a black judge could fairly oversee a case involving a wealthy white defendant. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like "Reed recuse now" and "Justice or Bias." Clayton, of course, was reveling in the chaos. He sat in his corner office, feet propped on his mahogany desk, watching the news cycle spin in his favor. Preston Hale, his attorney, stood nearby, phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with PR consultants. "We've boxed Reed in," Preston said, ending the call. "The pressure's mounting. If he doesn't recuse himself, the court's reputation takes a hit. If he does, we get a judge more sympathetic to our side." Clayton grinned, swirling his glass of Macallan. "See? You don't need facts when you control the narrative." That afternoon, back in court, the tension was electric. Judge Reed entered the room, his expression unreadable despite the storm brewing around him. The courtroom was packed, not just with legal observers, but with reporters, protesters, and concerned citizens from both sides of the racial and political divide. "Your Honor," Preston began, standing smoothly, "in light of recent revelations regarding your son's connection to a key witness, the defense formally requests that you recuse yourself from this case. The integrity of these proceedings demands nothing less." Reed's gaze didn't waver. "Mr. Hale, you've presented no evidence of actual bias, only insinuations designed to undermine this court's authority. Motion denied." Clayton, seated beside Preston, snickered audibly, knew he'd protect his own. Reed's eyes flicked toward him, calm but unyielding. "Mr. Rhodes, your commentary is neither requested nor appropriate." The prosecution, led by Yasmin Carter, wasted no time. They presented more damning evidence. Internal emails between Clayton and his CFO discussing how to bury liabilities by shifting funds between shell companies. A forensic accountant detailed how millions had been funneled offshore within hours of the DOJ launching its investigation, but Clayton remained unfazed. He leaned toward Preston, whispering, "Doesn't matter how much evidence they pile up, I've already tainted the jury pool. Half of them are questioning whether Reed's even legit." The worst blow came during the lunch recess. Reed was reviewing notes in his chambers when his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Decisions have consequences. Check your inbox." Frowning, he opened his court email. His breath caught. Attached was a photo of Angela leaving her school, clearly taken from a distance, time-stamped 30 minutes ago. Reed stood so fast, his chair toppled backward. He grabbed his phone and dialed Angela, heart pounding. After 2 rings, she answered, voice calm but clipped. "I saw the car tailing me. I'm already on my way to your brother's with Jalen. We're fine." Reed closed his eyes, relief flooding through him, quickly followed by cold fury. Clayton wasn't just attacking his reputation, he was targeting his family. By the time court reconvened, Reed's demeanor had shifted. He moved with the quiet, controlled determination of a man who had spent his entire life fighting against systemic odds. He knew men like Clayton thrived on fear and manipulation, But Reed had faced worse. He wasn't backing down. As the jury filed back in, Clayton leaned toward Preston, grinning. "Watch this, he's rattled. We've already won." But arrogance has a way of blinding men to the ground, crumbling beneath them. Reed adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat and spoke, his voice steady as bedrock. "Let me be clear," Reed announced, addressing the entire courtroom. "Personal attacks, threats, and attempts to undermine the judiciary will not influence these proceedings. This court operates on facts and the rule of law, not fear." He turned his gaze directly on Clayton, who, for the first time, shifted uncomfortably. In his seat. "And Mr. Rhodes," Reed continued, "if you believe wealth and intimidation place you above accountability, you are gravely mistaken." The gallery buzzed with murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously. Yasmin Carter, the prosecutor, hid a satisfied smile. But Reed knew the battle was far from over. Clayton had power, resources, and a ruthless disregard for boundaries. This was merely the opening salvo in a war that promised to get uglier. Comment number 1 if you believe Judge Reed made the right decision by standing his ground despite the threats. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to follow what happens next. But here's the question. When justice challenges privilege, how far will the powerful go to crush it? And can Reed withstand the next strike when the target is no longer just his career, but his very life? The morning after Judge Reed's defiant stand in court, the tension in Atlanta was palpable. Headlines blared from every newsstand. Federal judge refuses to recuse despite conflict allegations. Talk radio hosts debated whether Reed's determination was courage or bias. Social media remained ablaze with the hashtags Reed recuse now and justice or bias, fueled by strategically placed bot accounts pushing Clayton's narrative. Inside his penthouse, Clayton Rhodes sat at the breakfast bar, sipping black coffee as the news cycle spun in his favor. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Next step ready, just say the word." He smirked, tapping back a single word. "Proceed." By noon, the first blow landed. The Internal Affairs Division of the federal court announced an inquiry into Reed's conduct, citing the alleged conflict of interest involving his son and whistleblower, Marcus Hall. Though the investigation was clearly political theater, it was enough to tarnish Reed's credibility further. News outlets speculated on whether the judge could truly remain impartial, while conservative commentators framed Reed as an activist judge pushing a personal agenda. Reed, of course, was well aware of the inquiry before it hit the news. His phone buzzed endlessly, calls from colleagues offering cautious support, reporters hungry for a statement, and Angela, calm but worried. "Malcolm," she said during one call, "they're not just coming for your bench, they're coming for your name, for everything." But Reed's resolve only hardened. He sat in his chambers, meticulously reviewing the evidence stack against Clayton. Each document, each transaction told the same story: unchecked greed and ruthless exploitation. He knew the truth was on his side, but truth meant little when power controlled the narrative. Then came the second blow, far more personal and far more dangerous. That evening, as Reed prepared to leave the courthouse under increased U.S. Marshal protection, his phone buzzed again, another unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A distorted voice rasped through the line. "Step down, Judge, or tomorrow's headline won't be about your garage. It'll be about a tragic accident involving a woman and her son." Reed's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" The line went dead. His hand tightened around the phone as dread settled deep in his gut. He immediately called Angela, instructing her and Jalen to stay put, windows locked, alarms set. Then he notified the marshals, who increased surveillance around both his home and Angela's school. But Reed knew better than to believe law enforcement would deter whoever was behind the threats. Clayton's reach extended beyond official channels. Back in his penthouse, Clayton lounged on his leather sofa, sipping bourbon while watching the fallout unfold. Preston Hale sat nearby, reviewing notes for the next day's proceedings, but his usual confidence had waned. "Clayton," Preston said carefully, "this is getting out of hand. Intimidation is one thing. Threatening a judge's family, that's federal prison time if it gets traced back to you." Clayton chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. It won't. Loose ends are handled. Reed wants to play the hero. Fine. But even heroes break when their families are on the line. The next morning, Judge Reed entered the courthouse with Jalen's words echoing in his mind. They hate that a black man is the one holding power over Rhodes. The historical weight of systemic oppression pressed down on him, but so did the duty he'd sworn to uphold. Court was called to order, and the prosecution resumed its case. ADA Yasmin Carter introduced Tyrell Banks, a former junior accountant from Rhodes Holdings, who testified how he was instructed to falsify audit trails and backdate documents. The evidence was damning. Dates, emails, transaction logs, all pointing directly to Clayton's personal authorization. But Clayton, ever the predator, leaned toward Preston and whispered, "Watch this. We're about to flip the script." During cross-examination, Preston Hale shifted tactics. He didn't challenge Tyrell's facts, instead he attacked the man's credibility. "Mr. Banks," Preston began, voice silky smooth, "you were fired from Rhodes Holdings 2 years ago, correct?" Tyrell frowned. "Laid off, not fired. The division was downsized." "Downsized," Preston echoed, feigning thoughtfulness. "Interesting. Yet, records show you filed a wrongful termination suit, claiming racial discrimination, one that was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Are you sure your testimony today isn't just personal revenge against Mr. Rhodes?" The courtroom murmured. Tyrell's face flushed. "That lawsuit had nothing to do with this case. But it speaks to your character," Preston pressed, smiling faintly. "A man with a grudge, willing to say whatever it takes to settle an old score." "Objection, Your Honor," Yasmin snapped. "Relevance?" Judge Reed, ever composed, responded, "Sustained. Mr. Hale, stay on topic." But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted, not in the judge's mind, but in the jury's. Clayton's smirk widened as Tyrell stepped down, clearly shaken. The final blow of the day came when Clayton's PR machine leaked a fabricated email, supposedly from Reed to Marcus Hall, discussing the trial. It was crude, obviously fake to anyone familiar with digital forensics, but sensational enough for the evening news. "Federal judge caught colluding with prosecution witness," the headline screamed. Reed sat in his chambers long after sunset, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. He scrolled through the endless stream of vitriol online, death threats, racial slurs, calls for his removal. It wasn't just professional attacks anymore. It was personal, aimed at dismantling everything he'd built. But amidst the noise, one comment stood out. "Men like Reed think they can climb the ladder, but they forget who built the damn thing." Reed stared at the words, jaw tightening. He hadn't forgotten. He'd just refused to stay at the bottom. Meanwhile, in the shadows of Atlanta's underbelly, the men Clayton had paid to handle Reed's family were already on the move. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It was about breaking a man who dared to challenge privilege. Clayton, lounging in his penthouse, raised his glass once more. "To justice," he sneered, "served the way it's always been." But power, like fortune, is fickle, and Clayton had made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated how far a man like Reed would go when everything he loved was on the line. The sun had barely risen when Judge Malcolm Reed received the call. His wife Angela's voice, usually composed even in crisis, trembled through the line. "Malcolm," she whispered, "someone broke into the house last night." Reed shot upright, in bed, heart pounding. "What, are you okay? Is Jalen—" We're fine," Angela interrupted quickly. "They didn't take anything, just trashed the place. Kitchen overturned, drawers pulled out, like they were searching for something." Reed's grip tightened around the phone. This wasn't random, this was Clayton escalating. First threats, now outright invasion. "Get Jalen and head to my brother's house," Reed ordered. "I'll have the marshals meet you there." Angela hesitated. "Malcolm," there was a note on Jalen's bed. His blood ran cold. "What did it say?" Her voice cracked. "Drop the case, final warning." Reed closed his eyes, rage and fear warring inside him. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was personal. And if Clayton thought Reed would fold under pressure, he'd gravely miscalculated. At the courthouse, Reed's arrival didn't go unnoticed. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. Judge Reed, are you stepping down after the threats? How can you remain impartial with your family under attack? Is justice worth risking your life? Reed ignored them, pushing through the throng with U.S. Marshals flanking him. Inside, the courthouse buzzed. With tension, Naomi, his clerk, met him at the door to his chambers, her face pale. "Sir," she whispered, "they're not just targeting you. 3 of the prosecution's key witnesses reported vandalism at their homes last night. Tyrell Banks, his car, was set on fire outside his apartment." Reed's jaw clenched. Clayton wasn't just playing dirty. He was burning every bridge that threatened his empire. In the courtroom, Clayton Rhodes sat confidently at the defense table, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression smug. Preston Hale leaned over, whispering something that made Clayton chuckle. The bailiff called the court to order, and Reed took his seat, spine rigid, eyes cold. He scanned the room, jury tense, reporters scribbling, Yasmin Carter shuffling papers. At the prosecution's table, but it was Clayton's eyes that held his gaze. "You can't touch me," they seemed to say. "Not where it counts. Proceed," Reed ordered, voice steady despite the storm inside him. The prosecution called its next witness, Derek Shaw, a former project manager at Rhodes Holdings. Derek was supposed to testify about falsified safety, reports on low-income housing projects that Clayton had cut corners on to maximize profits, leaving families in hazardous conditions. But when Derek took the stand, his hand trembled as he raised it for the oath. His face was pale, beads of sweat glistening under the fluorescent lights. "Mr. Shaw," Yasmin began carefully, "can you confirm that you oversaw the Washington Heights project under Rhodes Holdings in 2020? Derek swallowed hard, glancing toward Clayton, who sat casually with one arm draped over the back of his chair, watching like a predator. I can't," Derek muttered, voice barely audible. Yasmin frowned. "Excuse me?" Derek's eyes darted around the room. "I withdraw my statement. I can't testify." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Yasmin shot to her feet. "Your Honor, Mr. Shaw previously provided sworn affidavits detailing—" "I'm not talking," Derek blurted, panic etched into every line of his face. "I have kids. I'm not risking them for this." Reed's gavel cracked like thunder. "Mr. Shaw, you're under subpoena. If you refuse to testify, you'll be held in contempt." Derek didn't flinch. He simply looked at Reed, then at Clayton before shaking his head slowly. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. Jail's safer than crossing him." Silence suffocated the room. Reed's gaze flicked toward Clayton, who smiled, slow and victorious. The message was clear. "I control the board. Checkmate." But Reed wasn't finished playing. "Bailiff," Reed said, voice cold, "escort Mr. Shaw into custody for contempt. This court will not tolerate witness intimidation." Clayton chuckled under his breath. Reed ignored it, turning to Yasmin. "Ms. Carter, proceed with your next witness." But the damage was done. The jury had seen the fear. Clayton's strategy was working, not just undermining the case, but demonstrating his unchecked power. If witnesses wouldn't testify, there'd be no conviction. After court adjourned for the day, Reed retreated to his chambers, exhaustion pulling at every muscle. Naomi entered quietly, closing the door behind her. "Sir," she said, voice tight, "there's something you need to see." She placed a manila envelope on his desk, no return address. Reed opened it carefully, revealing a single USB drive and a handwritten note. "You want the truth? Follow the money." Reed's brow furrowed. He inserted the drive into his laptop, Naomi watching over his shoulder. The screen flickered, then displayed a series of encrypted folders. Reed clicked through them, heart pounding as the contents revealed themselves. Offshore bank statements, shell company transfers, email chains between Clayton and high-ranking city officials. Proof, not just of financial fraud, but bribery, racketeering, and conspiracy to intimidate federal witnesses. "Sir," Naomi breathed, "this is enough to bury him." Reed's mind raced. Who had sent this? An insider turning on Clayton? A rival tired of his dominance? It didn't matter. What mattered was that they finally had leverage, if they could get it admitted into evidence without tipping Clayton off. But power never relinquishes control quietly. As Reed sat back, contemplating his next move, his phone buzzed with another anonymous text. "Nice try. Evidence means nothing if you're not alive to present it." Reed stared at the screen, the weight of the threat pressing down. Clayton wasn't just fighting for his fortune, he was fighting to destroy anyone who challenged his supremacy. Comment number 1 if you think Judge Reed should push forward with the new evidence despite the threats. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated as the battle for justice reaches its boiling point. But here's the question. With everything on the line, can Reed expose Clayton before the next attack strikes closer to home? Or will power once again crush those who dare to challenge it? Judge Malcolm Reed sat in his dimly lit chambers, the glow of his laptop illuminating the damning evidence on the screen. Bank transfers, shell company trails, emails linking Clayton Rhodes to bribery, extortion, and intimidation. It was enough to dismantle Clayton's empire and put him behind bars for decades. But power like Clayton's didn't crumble without a fight, and the threat that buzzed on Reed's phone minutes earlier made that painfully clear. Nice try. Evidence means nothing if you're not alive to present it. Reed inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He'd faced threats before, but this was different. This wasn't just about professional ruin, it was personal. They'd targeted his family, his integrity, his very existence, yet surrendering now would betray everything he'd ever stood for. He called Yasmin Carter immediately. "I need you. In my chambers. Now." 15 minutes later, Yasmin stood beside him, arms crossed tightly as she reviewed the files on the screen, her face darkened with each passing document. "This is a smoking gun," she muttered. "But if we enter this into evidence without verifying the source, Preston Hale will scream inadmissible and accuse us of tampering." Reed nodded grimly. "We need to authenticate it, fast, and we can't let Clayton catch wind." Yasmin frowned. "That's easier said than done. He's got eyes everywhere." Reed's gaze flickered toward his office window, the city lights casting fractured shadows across his desk. "Then, we move in silence. Secure chain of custody. File under. Seal until the last possible moment." Yasmin hesitated. "You know what he'll do when he realizes the walls are closing in, right?" Reed's jaw tightened. "He already promised worse than death. The only way out is through." The next morning, the tension in the courtroom was electric. Clayton Rhodes arrived with his usual entourage, clad in an immaculate charcoal suit, cufflinks gleaming like tiny daggers under the fluorescent lights. His smirk widened as he passed the prosecution table, locking eyes with Reed, who presided from the bench with stoic resolve. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, the Honorable Judge Malcolm Reed presiding. Reed's gavel struck once, sharp and deliberate. "Court is now in session. Prosecution, call your next witness." Yasmin rose, voice steady, but eyes flickering with the weight of unspoken plans. "The prosecution recalls Mr. Marcus Hall to the stand." Clayton's smirk faltered. Marcus Hall, the whistleblower who'd first exposed Clayton's pension fund fraud, had gone into hiding after receiving threats. Everyone assumed he'd been scared into silence. But now, escorted by 2 U.S. Marshals, Marcus strode into the courtroom, face set with quiet determination. Preston Hale shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This witness was not disclosed for recall." Reed barely glanced at him. "Overruled. Mr. Hall was previously sworn and remains under oath." Marcus settled into the witness chair, gripping the armrests like a man holding on to resolve itself. Yasmin approached, voice firm. "Mr. Hall," she began, "you previously testified about the pension fund discrepancies you discovered while employed at Rhodes Holdings. Since your initial testimony, have you uncovered additional information irrelevant to this case?" Marcus glanced at Clayton, whose face darkened. "Yes, ma'am. After I testified, I was approached by someone within Rhodes Holdings, someone tired of covering for Mr. Rhodes." Preston Hale practically leapt from his seat. "Objection. Hearsay." Reed raised a hand. "Overruled for now. Continue, Mr. Hall." Marcus nodded. "They provided digital records, transfers through shell companies, routed offshore, emails showing direct orders from Mr. Rhodes to falsify, audit and intimidate whistleblowers. Yasmin's expression didn't change, but her eyes burned with quiet triumph. "Your Honor," she said, "the prosecution moves to submit Exhibits H through M, verified documentation corroborating Mr. Hall's testimony." Clayton's face twisted into something ugly. He leaned toward Preston, whispering furiously. Preston stood, voice sharp. "Your Honor, we object to these exhibits. Their provenance is questionable and the defense was not given prior access." Reed's gaze never wavered. "The exhibits were authenticated by independent forensic analysts. Last night. Defense will receive copies immediately. Objection overruled." Clayton shot to his feet. "This is a damn witch hunt. You're railroading me, Judge. This is personal." The courtroom gasped. It was rare to see Rhodes lose his composure, but fear now etched lines into his perfectly smooth facade. Reed's gavel slammed down. "Mr. Rhodes, sit down and remain silent, or I'll hold you in contempt." For the first time, real panic flickered across Clayton's face. He wasn't used to losing control. The prosecution continued, each piece of evidence driving another nail into the coffin Clayton had built for himself. The jury watched intently, their earlier uncertainty now replaced by grim understanding. This wasn't corporate maneuvering, it was organized crime wrapped in boardroom polish. By noon recess, Preston Hale's face was ashen. In the hallway, away from prying ears, he grabbed Clayton's arm. "We need to settle now, offer restitution, plea down, this is spiraling." But Clayton yanked his arm free, eyes burning. "Settle? With him?" He jabbed a finger toward the courtroom where Reed stood talking quietly with U.S. Marshals. "I don't lose ever." Preston hesitated. "Then you'd better pray you still have enough leverage to bluff your way out, because if this evidence holds, you're done." Clayton's mind raced. He still had contacts, people who owed him favors, people who could make problems disappear. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Another unknown number. He answered. The voice was cold, professional. "Final opportunity. Mr. Rhodes, you want the judge off your back? The price just doubled." Clayton's lips curled into a snarl. "Do it. I don't care what it takes." He hung up, face twisting into something primal. If Reed wanted to play hardball, Clayton would remind him who owned the field. But even the most powerful men forget one truth. Desperation breeds mistakes. And Clayton was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Judge Malcolm Reed stood at the bench, gavel in hand, eyes locked on Clayton Rhodes. The courtroom buzzed with tension. After the morning's revelations, Clayton's once confident facade had cracked, revealing something raw and dangerous beneath. But Reed wasn't fooled. Cornering a predator didn't make it harmless, it made it desperate. "Court will reconvene after a 1-hour recess," Reed announced, striking the gavel sharply. "Bailiff, clear the courtroom." The spectators filed out slowly, murmuring amongst themselves. Journalists tapped furiously on their phones, headlines already forming. Rhodes' empire collapsing? New evidence buries real estate mogul. Judge Reed holds firm despite threats. Reed watched Clayton rise from the defense table, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched along his temples. "Preston," Hale whispered furiously in his ear, but Clayton waved him off, striding toward the exit like a man determined to regain control. Yasmin Carter approached the bench, brow furrowed. "Judge, Marcus Hall just called. Someone broke into his hotel room during recess, nothing taken, just trashed, like they were sending a message." Reed's stomach sank. He leaned closer, voice low. "Did he report it?" "Marshals are handling it," Yasmin confirmed. But Hall spooked. "If he bolts, we lose our strongest corroborating witness." Reed nodded grimly. "Put Hall under 24-hour protection. No movement without escort." Yasmin hesitated, then whispered, "Sir, what if Clayton doesn't stop? He's already crossed every ethical and legal line. We're backing him." "Hand to a corner," Reed's gaze hardened. "Then we remind him that the law doesn't bow to bullies." But Clayton Rhodes wasn't a man content to wait for the hammer to fall. As he exited the courthouse, flanked by his bodyguards, he barked into his phone, voice sharp as broken glass. "Get it done. I don't care who you have to pay off or threaten. That judge doesn't make it to the verdict." The voice on the other end was equally cold. Understood. It'll look like an accident. Clayton ended the call, pocketing his phone with a satisfied smirk. He glanced back at the courthouse, the towering facade bathed in the afternoon sun. In his world, problems didn't exist long enough to become consequences. Power erased obstacles. And Malcolm Reed, he was about to become just another forgotten name. Inside, Reed returned to his chambers, exhaustion pulling at his limbs. He loosened his tie and sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. His phone buzzed. Another anonymous text. Last warning, step down or be taken down. Reed exhaled slowly. Fear gnawed at the edges of his resolve, but anger burned brighter. He'd fought too hard, climbed too far to cower now. He typed a quick response. See you in court. He didn't notice the figure in the hallway watching his office door. Nor did he see the small black device discreetly affixed to the underside of his desk until his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a video feed. The PAF screen showed his own office from an angle just beneath the desk. The message below it read, "We see everything. Time's up, Judge." Reed's heart pounded. He rose quickly, scanning the room for anything out of place. His eyes landed on the desk. He crouched, reaching underneath, and froze. A tracking device, no, something more, a listening device, paired with a small, blinking red light. Surveillance. They weren't just threatening him. They were monitoring his every move. He grabbed his phone, dialing the courthouse marshals. "This is Judge Reed. Lock down my chambers. We have a security breach." The line went dead before the second ring. His phone screen flickered, then blacked out completely. Panic surged, but Reed forced it down. He wasn't just a target now. He was prey, and the hunter was closing in. Across town, Clayton sipped an espresso in the private lounge of his penthouse, watching the courthouse live feed on his tablet. The smug grin returned as he leaned back, satisfied. One more pawn off the board. Back in the courthouse, Reed moved quickly. He couldn't stay isolated. He had to get to Yasmin, to the marshals, to anyone who could secure the evidence and expose the threat. But as he opened his office door, two uniformed men stepped into the hallway, blocking his path. "Judge Reed?" One asked, voice neutral. "Marshal service, we're here to escort you home." Reed frowned. Something was off. Their uniforms were pristine, but the badges, slightly askew. One man's radio was clipped upside down, small details but glaring. To someone trained to notice inconsistencies, Reed stepped back slowly. "Who sent you?" The second man smiled coldly. "Your best interest, Judge. Let's not make this difficult." Reed didn't wait. He slammed the door and threw the deadbolt, heart racing. From the corner of his eye, he spotted the emergency exit leading to the back staircase. The fake marshals pounded on the door. "Open up, we're not here to hurt you." Reed didn't believe that for a second. He grabbed the USB drive with the incriminating evidence from his safe, shoved it into his pocket, and bolted for the emergency exit. The pounding grew louder. Then the sharp crack of splintering wood. Reed took the stairs two at a time, mind racing. If Clayton was bold enough to send imposters into a federal courthouse, the situation had escalated beyond intimidation. This was an assassination attempt. Bursting into the ground-level hallway, Reed collided with Naomi, his clerk, nearly knocking her off her feet. "Sir, what's—" "No time," Reed snapped. "Get to Yasmin, tell her to secure the evidence and call the FBI, now." Naomi's eyes widened in horror, but she nodded and sprinted toward the main courtroom. Reed headed for the south exit, heart hammering. He reached for his phone, but it was still dead. Cut off, isolated, just like they wanted. Outside, the street bustled with the usual courthouse activity, lawyers, reporters, and pedestrians, oblivious to the silent war unfolding within the marble walls. Reed spotted two more men in suits across the street, eyes locked on the exit, watching, waiting. He doubled back, slipping into the underground parking garage, adrenaline flooding his veins. He needed a secure line, backup, reinforcements, anything, to counter Clayton's tightening grip. But as he reached his car, the sharp click of a safety being released froze him in place. "Don't move," a voice ordered from the shadows. Reed slowly raised his hands, dread curdling in his stomach. The man stepped into the flickering garage light. One of Clayton's enforcers, cold-eyed and deliberate. "You should have taken the warning, Judge," the man sneered. "Now you're gonna disappear like the rest who cross roads." Reed's mind raced. He couldn't outrun a bullet, couldn't talk his way out. But surrender, not an option. The enforcer stepped closer, gun trained on Reed's chest. "Say goodbye, Judge." A car engine roared to life nearby. Tires screeched. Headlights flared. In the split second of distraction, Reed dropped to the ground. The gunshot echoed through the garage, sparking off concrete as the bullet missed its mark. The speeding car, a black sedan driven by Yasmin, skidded into view, passenger door swinging open. "Get in," she shouted. Reed didn't hesitate. He scrambled into the seat as Yasmin floored the accelerator, tires screeching as they shot out of the garage into midday traffic. Horns blared, pedestrians gawked. But Reed's focus remained on the shrinking figure of the enforcer in the rearview mirror, phone already pressed to his ear, no doubt calling Clayton. Yasmin's knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "Sir, what the hell is going on?" Reed panted, clutching the USB drive. "Clayton's done playing games. He wants me dead." Her face hardened. "Then we end this. No more caution. We take this straight to the feds." Reed nodded, determination solidifying. Clayton wanted a war. He'd just picked a fight with the wrong judge. Comment number 1 if you think Judge Reed should go all in and expose Clayton, no matter the risk. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated as this battle for justice reaches its breaking point. But here's the real question. With the walls closing in, can Reed survive long enough to deliver the final blow? Or will Clayton's empire crush him before the truth sees daylight? The city blurred past as Yasmin Carter sped through downtown, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Judge Malcolm Reed sat in the passenger seat, breath coming in short bursts, one hand clutching the USB, drive containing the evidence that could finally dismantle Clayton Rhodes. The adrenaline still coursed through his veins from the near miss in the parking garage, but his mind remained sharp, calculating. "Where do we go?" Yasmin asked, voice taut with urgency. Reed didn't hesitate. "Federal building. We get this to the U.S. Attorney's office. They can secure the evidence and open an immediate indictment." Yasmin swerved through traffic, eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. "You really think Clayton doesn't have people watching that place too? He owns half the city's movers and shakers." "Then we go to someone he can't buy," Reed said firmly. "Special Agent Derek Foster. He's been circling Rhodes for years, waiting for an airtight case. This is it." Yasmin nodded and made a sharp left, tires screeching against asphalt. Foster's office is across from the federal building. 20 minutes if traffic holds. But traffic didn't hold. 2 black SUVs appeared behind them, weaving aggressively through lanes. Reed's heart sank. "We've got company," Yasmin cursed under her breath. "Hold on." The sedan lurched forward as she floored the gas, dodging between slower cars. Horns blared. Pedestrians on crosswalks jumped back, shouting. One SUV gained on them rapidly, the tinted windshield hiding the driver's face. Reed's phone, miraculously, back online after Clayton's tech interference, buzzed on the dashboard. He glanced at the screen, unknown number. He answered, voice cold. "Reed!" Clayton's voice oozed through the speaker, calm and venomous. "You're really pushing your luck, Judge. You had a good run. Respected, untouchable. Now look at you running like a common criminal." Reed's grip tightened around the phone. "You're done, Rhodes. The evidence is solid. You can't intimidate the entire federal system." Clayton chuckled, low and menacing. "Who said I need to? All I have to do is remove the messenger. And right now you're nothing but a loose end." The line went dead. At that exact moment, the SUV behind them surged forward, bumping the back of Yasmin's car. She fought to maintain control, swerving dangerously close to the curb. Reed's mind raced. They couldn't outrun trained pursuers, not in city traffic, and they couldn't risk the evidence falling into the wrong hands. He glanced at the USB, drive in his hand, then back at Yasmin. "Get us to the East River," he ordered. Her eyes widened. "What? That's the opposite direction." "Exactly. They expect us to run towards safety. We go where they won't anticipate. Trust me." Jaw set, Yasmin jerked the wheel hard right, cutting through an intersection as lights turned red. The SUVs hesitated, momentarily boxed in by cross-traffic. "That bought us 30 seconds, Yasmin muttered, sweat glistening on her brow. "Talk fast, Judge." Reed leaned forward, brain working faster than his pulse. "We ditched the car under the FDR overpass. Footpath leads to the riverfront. There's an old boathouse, abandoned. We get there, we split. You take the drive to Foster, I lead them away." Yasmin shot him a look of disbelief. "Split up? They want you dead, not me." "They'll target whoever they think has the evidence," Reed countered. "That's why I'm giving you a decoy." He reached into his bag, pulled out a second USB drive, identical in appearance but empty. "You take the real one. I'll make sure they chase the fake." Yasmin hesitated, weighing the risk. But the determination in Reed's eyes left no room for argument. She nodded once. "Fine, but if you get yourself killed, I'm dragging your ghost to testify." The SUVs had cleared the intersection, roaring back into pursuit as the sedan sped toward the East River. 5 minutes. That's all they needed. The skyline stretched ahead, glass towers glinting in the sun, oblivious to the life-and-death chase unfolding beneath their shadow. Reed's mind flicked through contingency plans, each more precarious than the last. Finally, Yasmin skidded the sedan into the narrow service road beneath the FDR overpass. Dust and gravel kicked up as she slammed the brakes, tires squealing in protest. Both jumped out, Reed clutching the fake drive, Yasmin pocketing the real one. "Go!" Reed barked, pointing toward the boathouse barely visible through the chain link. "Fence?" Yasmin hesitated, eyes flicking toward the approaching SUVs. "I'm not leaving you. Now, Yasmin," Reed snapped, pushing her toward the footpath. "This ends today, one way or another." Reluctantly, she ran, her silhouette, disappearing between the concrete pillars. Reed took a deep breath, squared his shoulders and bolted in the opposite direction, straight toward the SUVs. The lead vehicle screeched to a halt, doors flying open as armed men poured out, guns low but ready. "Judge Reed," one barked. "Stop right there." Reed didn't stop. He sprinted across the service road, ducking behind a pillar just as the first shot cracked the air. The bullet ricocheted off concrete, biting into the dust near his feet. "They're not trying to kill me here," Reed realized. "Too public. They want to grab me, make it look clean." Good. That bought him time. He doubled back through the underpass, heart pounding, every step echoing against the concrete walls. The fake drive burned hot in his pocket, bait for the wolves. Up ahead, a narrow alley opened onto a side street, bustling with oblivious pedestrians. Reed ran straight into the crowd, dodging between tourists and delivery workers. The pursuers hesitated, unsure whether to risk firing in broad daylight. One shouted into a radio, "Eastbound, foot pursuit!" Reed glanced back, 3 men closing fast. He ducked into another alley, vaulted a low fence, and landed hard on the other side, knees buckling. Pain shot through his leg, but he pushed forward, driven by sheer will. 2 blocks away, Yasmin reached the boathouse, lungs burning. She yanked out her phone and dialed Agent Derek Foster. "Foster, it's Carter. Reed's in trouble. I have the drive. East River Boathouse. Get here now." "On my way," Foster snapped. "Stay put. Back up inbound." Yasmin pressed against the boathouse wall, peering toward the underpass. She could hear faint shouting, Reed's voice sharp and defiant. Then silence. Her heart clenched. No, not like this. Suddenly, tires screeched nearby. A black SUV, different from the pursuers, sped down the service road, blue lights flashing discreetly behind the grille. Foster. The SUV skidded to a halt and the rear door flew open. "Get in!" Foster barked. Yasmin didn't hesitate. She threw herself into the vehicle, thrusting the USB drive into Foster's hand. "Go!" she shouted. As the SUV sped away, Yasmin twisted in her seat, searching desperately for any sign of Reed. Nothing. The service road, the underpass, the footpath, they were empty, like the earth had swallowed him whole. "Where's the judge?" Foster demanded, eyes flicking between the road and the drive in his hand. Yasmin swallowed hard, voice hollow. He ran the other way, to buy time. Foster's jaw clenched. "We'll find him. First, we secure this." The SUV disappeared into city traffic, the weight of the drive in Foster's hand promising justice. But at what cost? Under the East River overpass, the dust settled. The SUVs idled, doors open, engines humming like predators waiting for their prey to break cover. But Malcolm Reed was nowhere to be found. The hum of the city faded as Judge Malcolm Reed stumbled down a narrow alley, heart pounding in his chest. His leg throbbed from the hard landing over the fence, but adrenaline dulled the pain. He clutched the fake USB drive in his hand, knowing that it was the only thing keeping Clayton Rhodes' men on his tail and off Yasmin. Every second he bought was another step closer to justice, but the odds were closing in fast. The alley opened into a small loading dock behind an abandoned warehouse. Reed ducked into the shadows, pressing his back against the cold brick wall. He pulled out his phone, hands trembling, and tried Foster's number. Straight to voicemail. Either the line was jammed or Foster was already in action. Reed prayed. It was the latter. Footsteps echoed nearby. The heavy thud of boots, methodical and unhurried, like hunters closing in on cornered prey. "Judge Reed!" a voice called, sharp and mocking. "We know you're hurt. No point in running. Hand over the drive and maybe we'll let you walk away." Reed swallowed hard, eyes darting for an escape route. The warehouse door to his left was padlocked. The fence he'd vaulted was too high to climb back with his injured leg. The only path left was forward, straight through the loading bay, an open kill zone. He tightened his grip on the fake drive. "Think, Malcolm. Think." Suddenly, the walkie-talkie on one of the pursuers crackled. "Negative on the girl. She's gone. SUV picked her up. Repeat, target is gone." The lead pursuer cursed under his breath. "Rhodes won't like that. He wanted both of them." Another voice chimed in, colder. "Then we take the judge. He's the face of this whole mess. Make an example of him." Reed's blood ran cold. There would be no negotiating, no mercy. Clayton wasn't just covering tracks anymore. He was sending a message. Drawing a shaky breath, Reed eased along the wall, inching toward the corner of the loading bay. He peeked around the edge. Two men stood near the alley entrance, guns drawn, but lowered. Another circled the far end, scanning the shadows. No clear path. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Foster? No. Unknown number. Reed hesitated, then answered quietly. "Judge Reed," the voice purred. "Clayton Rhodes, smooth, smug, deadly. I have to admit, you've impressed me. You lasted longer than most. But you're out of moves, old man." Reed's jaw clenched. "You're done, Rhodes. The evidence is already with Foster. Your empire's collapsing." Clayton chuckled. "Is it? Funny thing about empires, they don't fall quietly. You might have slipped a pawn past me, but the king's still on the board. And pawns, they're expendable." Reed froze. "What do you mean?" Pause. Then cold as ice. "Yasmin Carter, brave girl. Shame if something happened to her before she reached Foster's office." Reed's breath caught. "You're bluffing. Your men lost her." Clayton's laughter echoed through the line. "Did they? You forget who owns this city, Judge. Traffic cameras, private security feeds. Every eye out there reports to me. It wasn't hard to track the SUV once I knew what to look for." Panic surged through Reed. Yasmin thought she was safe, but Clayton's reach extended further than they'd prepared for. If she was intercepted now, everything would be lost. "What do you want?" Reed demanded, voice taut with desperation. "Simple," Clayton said smoothly. "The real drive. You hand it over, I call off my men. Yasmin walks away. You get to keep breathing. Everyone wins." Reed closed his eyes, mind racing. The drive was already out of his hands, but Clayton didn't know that. If Reed stalled long enough, maybe, just maybe, Foster's team could secure Yasmin and the evidence. "Meet me at Pier 17, Reed said finally, voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his gut. 1 hour. I'll bring the drive." Clayton paused, considering. "Smart choice, Judge. 1 hour. Come alone or the girl dies." The line went dead. Reed sagged against the wall, chest heaving. He'd bought time, but not much. Now he had to gamble everything on one final move. He pulled himself upright, ignoring the sharp pain in his leg, and slipped through the loading bay toward the riverfront. Every step felt heavier, each breath tighter. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making sure Clayton Rhodes finally faced the reckoning he'd evaded for too long. But as Reed limped toward Pier 17, one chilling thought gnawed at the back of his mind. What if I'm already too late? The sun hung low over the East River as Judge Malcolm Reed limped toward Pier 17, the breeze carrying the faint scent of salt and diesel. The wooden planks creaked beneath his weight, each step echoing in the eerie quiet of the abandoned dock. His injured leg screamed with every movement, but he pushed forward, jaw set, heart pounding. In his hand, the fake USB drive gleamed under the fading light, a desperate bluff, the only card he had left. Clayton Rhodes didn't know the real. Evidence was already with Foster. If Reed played this right, he could end this nightmare without another life lost. But if he failed, Yasmin Carter would pay the price. And Reed couldn't live with that. He reached the edge of the pier and stopped, eyes scanning the deserted waterfront. Empty shipping containers sat stacked like forgotten tombstones, their rusted surfaces glowing orange in the sunset. The water lapped lazily against the pilings below, masking the faint crunch of approaching footsteps. Reed didn't turn around. He didn't need to. "Right on time, Judge," Clayton Rhodes drawled, his voice smooth as silk and twice as sharp. "I was starting to think you'd lost your nerve." Reed slowly turned to face the man who had turned the city into his personal chessboard. Clayton stood flanked by two enforcers, both armed, their eyes cold and professional. The millionaire himself wore a tailored navy suit, gold cufflinks glinting as he adjusted his tie. The picture of untouchable arrogance. "Where's Yasmin?" Reed demanded, holding the fake drive up. "No girl, no deal," Clayton chuckled, nodding to one of his men. From behind a nearby container, Yasmin was dragged into view, wrists bound, lip bloodied but eyes fierce. The guard shoved her forward, and she stumbled, catching herself just short of the pier's edge. "Alive and well," Clayton said with mock cheer. "For now. The drive, Judge." Reed's fingers tightened around the USB. "You'll let her go first," Clayton sighed, as though indulging a stubborn child. "Do you really think you're in a position to negotiate? My men have sniper coverage on this entire pier. One twitch and both of you end up in the river. The only reason you're still breathing is because I want that drive." Yasmin's eyes locked with Reed's, silently pleading for him not to fold. She knew what was at stake. But Reed also saw the exhaustion in her face, the bruises forming along her temple. She'd risked everything to get the evidence out. He couldn't let her die here. He exhaled slowly, weighing the odds. Then deliberately he held the drive out. "Catch," Reed said, and tossed it high into the air. Time slowed. Clayton's eyes widened, hand snapping up to grab the falling drive. For one crucial second, his attention was off his men. Reed moved. With a surge of adrenaline, he lunged forward, slamming his shoulder into the nearest enforcer. The man staggered back, gun veering wide. Yasmin reacted instantly, kicking the second guard's knee out from under him. The crack of bone was drowned out by Clayton's enraged shout. "Shoot them! Shoot them both!" The first guard recovered, faster than Reed anticipated, swinging his pistol toward Yasmin. Without thinking, Reed threw himself into the line of fire. The gun roared. Pain exploded in his side as the bullet tore through flesh and muscle. Reed hit the deck hard, gasping for air. Blood blossomed across his shirt, warm and sticky. His vision blurred, but he saw Yasmin wrestle free, snatching the fallen guard's weapon. "Get down!" Yasmin shouted, and Reed barely managed to roll aside as she fired. 2 shots, clean, controlled. The second guard dropped, clutching his shoulder, gun clattering to the pier. Clayton stood frozen, the fake USB drive forgotten in his hand. His carefully cultivated mask of superiority cracked, replaced by raw panic. "No," Clayton muttered, taking a step back. This wasn't supposed to happen. Sirens wailed in the distance, Foster's backup finally closing in. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. Yasmin advanced, gun steady. "It's over, Rhodes. Drop the drive. Hands where I can see them." Clayton's gaze flicked between the approaching law enforcement and the determined woman blocking his escape. Desperation twisted his features into something ugly. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Clayton snarled, backing toward the edge of the pier. "I built this city. You think one stupid drive changes that? Judges, cops, politicians, they all answer to me. Yasmin didn't flinch. Not anymore. Behind Clayton, the wooden planks groaned ominously. Years of neglect had weakened the far end of the pier, and the added weight of the struggle had pushed the structure to its limit. Another step, and the wood splintered beneath Clayton's feet. For one brief, terrible moment he hung suspended, arms flailing, eyes wide with disbelief. Then the pier gave way entirely, and the millionaire who once ruled the city vanished into the dark waters. Below, the fake drive tumbling after him. Yasmin lowered the gun, chest heaving as the sirens grew louder. She turned to Reed, who lay motionless, blood pooling beneath him. "Malcolm," she cried, dropping to her knees beside him. "Stay with me, help's coming." Reed's eyelids fluttered, breath shallow. He managed a faint smile. "Told you, this ends today." The last thing he heard before the world faded to black was the crunch of boots on wood as Foster's team stormed the pier, weapons drawn. The battle was over. But the war for justice was just beginning. Bright hospital lights flickered above as Judge Malcolm Reed slowly opened his eyes. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled his nostrils, and the dull ache in his side reminded him he was alive, but barely. A soft beeping accompanied each sluggish, heartbeat steady but fragile, like the peace that followed the storm. Yasmin Carter sat by his bedside, dark circles under her eyes, hands clasped tightly together. The moment Reed stirred, she leaned forward, relief flooding her face. "You're awake," she whispered, voice thick with exhaustion and emotion. "They said you might not make it." Reed managed a weak smile. "Takes more than a bullet to keep me down," Yasmin exhaled a shaky laugh, wiping away tears, but the relief was short-lived. The memory of Clayton Rhodes, the fall, the splash, the unanswered question of his fate, hung between them like smoke after a fire. "Did they find him?" Reed rasped, struggling to sit up. Yasmin hesitated, eyes flickering toward the window where red and blue light still flashed faintly in the night. No body. Divers searched for hours, nothing but the fake drive and some torn fabric from his suit. Reed's jaw tightened. He'd seen too many men like Clayton slip through the cracks, wealthy, ruthless, untouchable. A fall into the river wasn't a death sentence for someone with Rhodes's resources. If Clayton was alive, he'd be planning his next move already. As if reading his thoughts, Yasmin added, "Foster put out a federal warrant. Every exit from the city is locked down. If he surfaces, they'll catch him." Reed nodded grimly. "If?" The door creaked open, and Detective Foster stepped inside, his usual stoic demeanor softened by genuine concern. He held a thick manila folder in one hand and a disposable coffee cup in the other. "Glad to see you're still with us, Judge," Foster said, setting the coffee down within reach. "You gave us a scare." "Been giving you those for years," Reed muttered, voice dry as sandpaper. "Tell me you've got good news." Foster's expression darkened. Good and bad. The real drive made it to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Indictments are already rolling out. Bank accounts frozen, shell companies exposed. Rhodes's empire is crumbling as we speak. Yasmin leaned in, eyes narrowing. "And the bad?" Foster sighed, flipping open the folder. Inside were surveillance photos, grainy but unmistakable. Clayton Rhodes stepping into a black sedan just minutes after the pier collapsed. His face was partially obscured by a hood, but the profile was unmistakable. "Security camera from a private dock 2 miles upriver," Foster said. "The car's plates were flagged, but by the time we traced them, the vehicle was torched in an industrial park. No prints, no DNA." Reed swore under his breath. "He's running, planning his next move," Foster nodded. "And with the money he's stashed overseas, he could disappear for years. But he's wounded, cornered. Desperate men make mistakes." The room fell silent, the weight of unfinished business pressing down on all three of them. Rhodes might be out of sight, but his shadow still stretched long across their lives. Yasmin broke the silence first. "So what now? We wait for him to strike again? Pretend like justice was served while he plots revenge?" Reed met her gaze, something hard and resolute in his tired eyes. "No. We stay ahead of him. We expose everything. Every corrupt official. He paid off every backdoor deal he made. We tear down the system that protected him piece by piece." Foster gave a wry smile. "Sounds like you just volunteered for the fight of your life, Judge." Reed smiled faintly. "I've been fighting my whole life. What's one more round?" 3 months later, the city looked different. Rhodes's properties stood empty, foreclosure signs plastered across luxury developments that once symbolized his dominance. Former allies now turned state's evidence to save, themselves each testimony another nail in the coffin of his legacy. But Rhodes himself, still a ghost. Rumors swirled, sightings in Costa Rica, whispers of offshore havens, but nothing concrete. The only certainty was the letter that arrived at Reed's chambers one crisp morning, postmarked from an unknown location. The envelope was plain, the handwriting meticulous. Inside was a single photograph, Reed and Yasmin standing on the courthouse steps after the first wave of indictments, exhaustion etched into their faces, but triumph burning in their eyes. Scrawled, across the bottom in red ink were 4 chilling words, "Not over, not yet." Reed stared at the message, jaw tightening. He handed it to Yasmin without a word. She read it, lips pressing into a thin line. "He's still out there," she said quietly. Reed nodded, slipping the photo into his desk drawer. "Let him watch, let him plan. This time we'll be ready." Outside the window, the city moved on, oblivious to the war still simmering beneath its polished surface. But Reed, Yasmin, and Foster knew the truth. Some battles never truly end. But as long as there were people willing to stand for justice, the fight would never be lost. The story of Judge Malcolm Reed and Clayton Rhodes reveals a harsh but powerful truth. Wealth and privilege can grant temporary power, but they cannot shield someone from accountability forever. Clayton's arrogance, fueled by systemic corruption and racism, made him believe he was untouchable. But in the end, his empire collapsed, not because of one dramatic moment, but because of the relentless pursuit of justice by those who refused to be silenced. Judge Reed's journey is equally significant. As a black man navigating a system often skewed against him, he faced not only professional challenges, but deeply personal attacks. Yet he stood firm, proving that resilience and integrity can dismantle even the most fortified walls of oppression. His survival wasn't just physical, it was moral. He didn't stoop to Clayton's level. Instead, he fought back with the very tools the system was supposed to uphold: truth, law, and persistence. Yasmin Carter's role reminds us of the power of community. No fight for justice is won alone. Her bravery, intellect, and refusal to back down were pivotal in exposing corruption. She demonstrated that when marginalized voices unite, they can challenge even the most entrenched systems of power. The lesson here is clear. Silence enables injustice, but courage, no matter how dangerous the path, creates change. Justice may be slow and the fight never truly ends, but every stand against corruption weakens its grip. What do you think? Should Rhodes have faced a harsher punishment, or was the collapse of his empire enough? Comment "Justice served" if you believe Reed's approach was the right one, or "Not enough" if you think Rhodes got off too easily. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more gripping narratives, and share this video to keep the conversation going. Thank you for watching, and remember, standing for justice is never easy, but it's always worth it. Stay safe, stay strong, and we'll see you in the next story.